September 1, 1943. Rabaul Aerodrome, New Britain. Lieutenant Commander Saburo Sakai holds a report wet by tropical rains. In silence, he reads the specifications of the new American aircraft. The name was pretentious. Hellcat. The weight? Double a zero. The appearance? Swollen, gross, disproportionate. When he finishes reading, he laughs. A short, confident laugh. Other officers laugh with him. To the elite of Japanese naval aviation, this was yet another American aberration. Big, noisy, inelegant. A new flying failure. That laughter, however, was the exact sound of an era about to end. What Sakai and his colleagues didn't know is that the F6F Hellcat wasn't just a fighter. It was the harbinger of a new kind of war, forged not in the lightness of dogfight, but in the solidity of mass production, created not to turn better, but to never have to turn. While Japan relied on philosophy, the United States relied on gears. This documentary reveals the trajectory of an underrated aircraft that didn't just beat the zeros, it erased them from the sky. Because in the end, it wasn't the most agile that survived. He was the most prepared. But before we dive into the data, there's one statistic that defines this story better than any metaphor. The F6F Hellcat, the plane that seemed too heavy for an aerial dogfight, shot down 5,223 enemy aircraft and was shot down only 270 times in combat. He didn't just fly tanks hit by incendiary bullets, he kept fighting. It climbed 3,500 feet per minute, carried 650 caliber machine guns, and flew as if defying physics itself. With each mission, the Japanese reports came back shorter. With each combat, an entire doctrine fell apart. The Americans were no longer building fighter jets. They were setting up aerial kill systems. If you value history told with rigor and respect for details, leave your support with a like and subscribe. This helps us to continue to bring to light the forgotten truths behind the statistics. Between 1941 and 1943, the skies of the Pacific seemed to belong exclusively to the Japanese Empire. The aircraft that sealed this dominance was the A6M-0, light, fast, almost mystical in its maneuverability. At that stage of the war, the Zero was not just an airplane, it was the physical extension of a doctrine. At Pearl Harbor, the Japanese destroyed 347 American aircraft with the loss of only 29. In the Philippines, the disproportion was even more aggressive. 7 Japanese losses against more than 100 American fighters shot down. Over Darwin, Australia, the pattern repeated itself. 2 Japanese aircraft shot down against 30 allies. Each mission reinforced the same conclusion. The Imperial pilots were superior, their machines invincible, and their enemies predictable. The Zero was built on a radical philosophy. Every gram removed from the fuselage meant advantage in combat. Shield? Unnecessary weight. Self-sealing tanks? It is dispensed with. Radios? Often removed. The focus was on the duel, the turn, the pilot as a lone warrior in symbiosis with the machine. The combat manual was almost a scripture, to teach how to shoot at close range, maneuver until you reach the tail, and die, if necessary, with honor. In the minds of its commanders, the Zero was a mirror of the samurai soul, fast, silent, lethal, and ready for sacrifice. This belief crystallized with the rise of aces like Hiroyoshi Nishizawa, who achieved 87 aerial victories and described Zero in spiritual terms. Flying Zero is like having wings of your own. The plane doesn't respond to commands, it responds to thought. For Americans, the psychological impact was devastating. The Zero flew farther, turned tighter, and shot down its targets with impressive ease. Allied engineers who examined captured models initially refused to believe the performance figures. A fighter with bomber range? Biplane maneuverability? Without weight, without protection, but with lethality? It seemed unreal. It was a common mistake at the time, confusing technical elegance with strategic invulnerability. The Americans, even in the face of evidence, still operated with fighters such as the P-40 Warhawk and the Brewster Buffalo, heavy, poorly armed, and clearly outclassed in the face of the Zero. American doctrine was stuck in the past, while Japan believed it had discovered the future. The arrogance, however, was not empty. Japan believed, based on numbers and tradition, that its naval aviation was invincible, and in fact, until 1943, it was. But what the Japanese generals didn't know, and what their pilots wouldn't realize until too late, was that the Americans weren't just trying to improve their planes. They were redesigning the war as a whole. While Japanese engineers worked by hand, manually adjusting parts for each individual Zero, the Americans designed modular airplanes with interchangeable parts, created to be mass-produced, repaired anywhere, and flown by any well-trained man. Japan formed aces. America, operators of lethal and replicable machines. And the difference began to show up in the data. In 1942, Japan produced 5,088 combat aircraft. The United States, in the same year, manufactured 47,836. The following year, the Japanese produced 8,161 aircraft. Americans, 85,898, a ratio of almost 10 to 1, a fact that the Japanese commanders ignored or preferred not to face. If this difference has already surprised you, comment now. Logistics wins, because that's exactly what the numbers showed. The war was no longer a dispute between pilots, and became a dispute between systems. Still, Japanese reports remained optimistic. The doctrine based on individual ability, lightness of structure, and superiority of spirit still seemed to work. But something was already beginning to change. Scattered reports emerged of encounters with fighters that did not behave like the previous ones. Heavy planes that did not flee, that they didn't rotate, that they did not make mistakes. The enemy had stopped trying to imitate the Zero, and had begun to project something completely different. They still didn't know his name, but soon they would know. Because when the first Hellcats appeared over Marcus Island, Japanese pilots finally understood. It was no longer a war of technique. It was a war of volume, technology, and coordination. One of the pilots who participated in those first missions wrote in his action report a sentence that ended an era. I fired my ammunition in turns and dives, and nothing fell. They came from above, in pairs, in silence. They didn't fly. They hunted. In the next part, the story ceases to be doctrine and becomes a shock. Japan will know the Hellcat, but not as an enemy, as a sentence. The first mentions of the F6F Hellcat in Japanese intelligence reports surfaced quietly in early 1943. The aircraft was described as a large carrier-based fighter powered by a Pratt & Whitney R2800 double wasp radial engine. With more than 12,000 pounds loaded, it looked like everything a fighter shouldn't be: heavy, bulky, not very agile. The physical dimensions left no doubt. The Zero weighed 5,800 pounds, the Hellcat twice as much. Its profile was grotesque in the eyes of Japanese engineers: short wings for the body, high flight line, and considerable frontal drag. The technical analysis was immediate and unanimous. The American aircraft was a misconception. Captain Minoru Genda, architect of the attack on Pearl Harbor and tactical advisor to the combined fleet, stated in an internal memo that the Americans had learned nothing. For him, the Hellcat represented the continuity of the flawed Western doctrine, to compensate for the pilot's lack of skill with armament and weight. But what Japanese analysts didn't see in the schematics and diagrams was the central principle of the machine. The Hellcat was not built to win turns, but to survive combat. It was the first modern naval fighter truly designed under the logic of the system, not the duel. Each feature of it was the consequence of an entirely different air combat doctrine, the energy doctrine. At 2,000 horsepower, the R2800 engine allowed the Hellcat to climb 3,500 feet per minute, even with full armor and 650 machine guns. Weight, far from being a flaw, was a weapon. It allowed for longer dives, more absorbable impacts, and attacks with accumulated energy. The fuselage structure used reinforced duralumin and included 212 pounds of armor around the pilot, 110 pounds of protection in the oil systems, and self-sealing fuel tanks capable of withstanding dozens of impacts. For Japanese pilots, accustomed to bare cabins and flimsy structures, it was like facing a flying ship. On paper, all of this seemed redundant. In the air, it was what saved lives. The philosophy of the Hellcat went beyond the physical design. He was part of an integrated tactical gear. Equipped with high-frequency radio, it operated in coordinated divisions, vectored by naval or airborne radar. Their job was not to hunt individually, but to be part of an aerial network, a lethal formation that communicated in real time, adjusted positions, set traps. The American Air War was no longer art. It became engineering. And behind the machine, there was the production line. Grumman, responsible for the Hellcat, organized its factory on Long Island to operate 24 hours a day. Every 60 minutes, a new fighter rolled off the assembly line. There were no variations. There were no manual adaptations. Each piece was interchangeable, each fuselage identical. The R-2800 engine had more than 2,800 machined components, with a tolerance of less than 0.001 inch. While Japanese engines required handmade assembly, no American technician had to adjust anything with manual precision. It was enough to assemble. The Hellcat wasn't just an airplane, it was a solution. A fighter that flew with a thick neck, high frontal drag, and clumsy look, but that he returned to the aircraft carrier even hit, even damaged, even with his pilot injured. It was a product of the American war mentality. Protect the pilot, standardize parts, simplify maintenance, and maximize damage to the enemy. The strength was not in the curve. It was in the cycle of return, refueling, and replenishment. The Japanese did not understand this. They called it a fighter ship, disguised bomber, and engineering error. They laughed at the visual. They ignored the principles. They didn't realize that the design that seemed unnatural was actually the beginning of an air doctrine that was based on data, not honor. By despising the robustness of the Hellcat, Japan also despised the industrial capacity that supported it. The American fighter didn't have to be pretty. It needed to be effective, durable, and replaceable. It was a weapon produced on a scale for a long war, and it was tested exactly like that. Not as an elite prototype, but as a critical mass. In 1943, the first Hellcats began operating in squadrons embarked in the Pacific. Within months, they had taken the skies back. The Japanese air combat doctrine, based on close maneuvers and close combat, was beginning to crumble in the face of a force that did not turn, climbed. He attacked from above. He came out of the line of fire, and it went up again. And for every Hellcat shot down, 5 more came down the assembly line. By the end of 1944, more than 12,000 units had been produced, a feat unthinkable for any Axis power. In Japan, the official reaction to this escalation was skeptical. Officials maintained confidence that the Hellcats would be defeated on the basis of technique, courage, and spin. Reality, however, began to impose itself. In initial encounters, the pilots reported something unheard of. The Americans were coming from above. They were in better positions. They were coordinated, were invulnerable. A Japanese petty officer recorded, "They didn't fight, they hunted." Japan believed it was facing another plane, but what appeared in the skies was not an aircraft. It was a system, and the system was just beginning to reveal itself. Because the moment the Hellcats encountered the first Zeros over Marcus Island, the air war changed. What happened that day marked the first vertical maneuver that Japanese aviation could not keep up with. And in the next part, we'll look at why a single turn in the sky was enough to seal the fate of hundreds of riders. September 30th, 1943, Marcus Island. The sky was clear and the sea below was silent. Petty Officer First Class Yoshio Fukui was conducting an escort mission for a reconnaissance aircraft when he spotted 6 dark shapes emerging from the southeast in the distance. His initial impression was clear: B-25 bombers on an unlikely route. The formation seemed too heavy to be fighters, but then the bombers turned, and they went up, almost vertically. Within seconds, Fukui realized it wasn't a bomber group. It was something that reports still called F6F type, Hellcats. The first reaction was automatic. He rolled into a tight corner, trying to use the Zero's well-known turning superiority. The maneuver had worked dozens of times against the P-40s, the Wildcats, the Buffaloes. But this time, the enemy did not follow the pattern. The Hellcat that was ahead did not try to turn. He accelerated in a straight line, climbed with power, gained altitude quickly, and then made a maneuver incomprehensible for the estimated weight of that aircraft. A hammer turn that placed him directly on the tail of Fukui's Zero. It was a move that required brute force and absolute control. What was supposed to be an escape curve turned into a vertical attack. Within 3 seconds, 650 machine guns fired in unison. Fukui's Zero was hit by 17 shells. Its fuselage was riddled with holes. Only a desperate curve saved him. He managed to return to base, alone. The reconnaissance plane he was escorting was shot down. His wingman, Masao Shimura, was never seen again. The fight lasted less than 5 minutes. No Hellcat was lost. It was the first blood. But what mattered was not the number of losses. It was the type of combat. Until that day, Japanese pilots operated under an unshakable conviction. Air warfare was decided on the turn, in close contact. The Zero was designed for this. Its wing load of only 22 pounds per square foot made it a natural extension of the human body. He could turn precisely, lightly, like a sword. The Hellcat, in contrast, had a wing load of 36.5 pounds per square foot. According to classical mathematics, it should be slow, unable to keep up with circular maneuvers. But the Americans had not designed the Hellcat to spin. They had drawn it to go up, to attack from above, to avoid the curve. Japanese doctrine was built on a tactical premise that was now becoming obsolete, and the pilot who tried to apply the old logic against the new reality discovered in seconds that he was facing not an adversary, but a new era. The R2800 engine delivered 700 horsepower more than the Zero's Nakajima Sakai. This translated into absolute dominance on the vertical axis, a type of combat that the Japanese neither trained nor understood. American tactics based on the concept of boom and zoom prioritized energy attacks, high-speed dives, accurate shots, and rapid retreat to safe altitude. No dogfights, no prolonged confrontations, no honor in the curve, just efficiency. And the numbers began to reflect this. With each new mission, the return rate of Japanese patrols dropped. The squadrons reported that the Hellcats maintained speed even at extreme climb angles, that their machine guns broke through armor with ease, that absorbed impacts and kept flying, who operated in pairs in constant communication, coordinating dives and escapes with almost mathematical precision. Japanese confidence was beginning to crack. Intelligence reports indicated a new type of threat, but there was still denial. Many commanders continued to believe that the doctrine of Zero was sufficient, that the Hellcats, despite their engines and guns, would be overcome by precise maneuvering and courage in combat. But Fukui knew the truth, and he was not the only one. Marcus Island was the first real test, and the result was more than a tactical defeat. It was a doctrinal breach. What the Japanese called skill, the Americans had replaced with power, armor, power, and volume of fire. What the Japanese called art, the Americans called the survival rate. The war had changed, and the most brutal proof of this was about to happen. Because a few days later, off Wake Island, 12 Zeros would attack a formation of Hellcats with all the tactical advantages, altitude, surprise, and position. And yet, they would be massacred. October 5th, 1943, Wake Island. 12 Zeros from the 252nd Air Group take off under the command of Lieutenant Yoshio Shiga to intercept an American attack. It was a routine mission, a hit-and-run attack, like so many others. They had all the advantages. They were above. They came with the sun at their backs, and they knew where the enemy would be. The surprise was total. But on that day, for the first time, the pattern was broken. When they saw the American fighters, Shiga was surprised by the formation. They were Hellcats arranged in 3 divisions, each covering the space of the other. Instead of scattering or fleeing when attacked from above, as so many Allied planes before them had done, the Hellcats dived together, en bloc, maintaining energy, absorbing the first shots. The Japanese opened fire relying on the impact of the first shots, but the shells ricocheted off the armor. The Americans weren't just flying. They were testing a new doctrine. Keep the energy, keep the formation, and fight back from above, with discipline, brute force, and constant communication. That's what they did. With self-sealing tanks, systems protected by 300 pounds of armor, and operational radio between squadrons, the Hellcats acted as an extension of the carrier's onboard radar. They climbed to where the Zero's engines lost power, then dived at full power, discharging 4,500 rounds per minute with their 650 machine guns. 8 Zeros were shot down. No Hellcat was lost. The samurai doctrine based on individual maneuvers proved vulnerable in the face of an enemy that did not fight for honor. It fought for efficiency. The difference was clear. The Japanese pilots operated in isolation. The Americans, in a network. Meanwhile, the Japanese structural base began to crumble. Fuel shortages forced squadrons to reduce flight time. The training of new pilots was rushed. In some units, shooting practice was limited to 50 rounds per airman. Radios, seen as unnecessary weight, were still absent in many fighters. In Taiwan, October 1944, this doctrinal difference would turn into annihilation. The largest concentration of Japanese aircraft since Midway was assembled to meet the attacks of Task Force 38. More than 700 fighters and bombers were launched with the aim of halting the American advance. The Japanese fleet prided itself on the scale of the counterattack. The next day, reports announced victory. 26 Allied ships sunk, more than 300 planes shot down. But the Hellcat's gun camera footage showed another scenario. The actual American losses were 89 aircraft, the Japanese 329, and almost all veteran drivers. The defeat was not only military, it was structural. Japan had exhausted its best men by trying to apply an old doctrine against a new system. The irony of this story is that the solution was in front of them. If you're enjoying unraveling these facts, show your support. Like and subscribe so we can bring you more detailed content like this. What the Japanese command did not yet know, but some pilots already realized, was that the Hellcat had not been designed to compete in the same type of combat. It had been made to ignore traditional combat. And with each new mission, the American doctrine of combat based on energy, communication, and redundancy imposed itself like an unstoppable cog. The battlefield was no longer tactical. It became logistical. Soon this change would take on a new dimension. The sky would become just another cog in industrial production. Because while Japan counted aircraft manually, the United States mass-produced them every hour, as if manufacturing for endless war. And that's exactly what they did. The true strength of the F6F Hellcat was not just in what it did in the sky, but in the way it was built on Earth. The heart of the machine was the Pratt & Whitney R2800 double-wasp radial engine. With 2,000 horsepower, this mechanical monster allowed the Hellcat to reach climb and acceleration speeds that no Japanese fighter could match. But the most impressive thing was not the power, it was the way it was delivered. The R2800 was a modular engine, designed with interchangeable parts, machined to a standardized tolerance, capable of being disassembled and reassembled in any theater of operations with standardized tools and trained mechanics. Each engine left the factory identical to the previous one, a feat that seemed like science fiction to the Japanese, who were used to assembling Nakajima engines by hand, with manual adjustment and variations between units. No two engines were the same in Japan. In the United States, each piece of the Hellcat fit together like industrial clock gear. Interchangeability did not stop at the engine. The 6 Browning M250 machine guns mounted on the wings had the same principle: replaceable parts, simplified maintenance, large-scale production. Every barrel, spring, mount, and trigger conformed to the same pattern, allowing mobile arsenals on ships or forward bases to replace damaged parts within minutes. The same was true for the armored windshields, the hydraulic systems, the control panels. Every element of the Hellcat obeyed the logic of a system that didn't rely on improvisation. It depended on scale. The fuselage structure was made by optimized riveting, with reinforced duralumin, allowing strength without sacrificing production speed. Where the Japanese polished and adjusted by hand, the Americans assembled with industrial jigs. Grumman's production line operated with continuous shifts. During the peak of the war, a new Hellcat was completed every 61 minutes. Japan, with all its expertise and dedication, took years to reach the production of 10,000 Zeros. The United States produced more than 12,000 Hellcats in just 30 months. This meant something very simple. The Japanese built heroes. The Americans built supremacy. Logistics kept pace. Aircraft carriers such as the USS Essex and USS Enterprise carried spare parts, tools, and technicians capable of assembling engines in the middle of the ocean. Pilots were trained in simulators, continental bases, and escorted by experienced instructors. A pilot shot down a Zero, returned to deck, refueled, and was ready to fly again in less than 40 minutes. The American doctrine was not one of resistance. It was one of rotation. There was no room for individual glorification. The pilot was a cog in a wheel. He was trained to operate, communicate, and survive. The Japanese doctrine, still centered on the figure of the aerial samurai, became obsolete in the face of a machine that produced war, as an industry produces cotton. War was no longer a duel. It became production. And the enemy slowly began to understand. Japanese engineers inspecting downed Hellcats reported surprise. Engineering Captain Hideo Nakamura wrote in his report, "Every component seems to have been made to be used, swapped, and repurposed. There is no romanticism, just function." That was the secret of the Hellcat. He didn't have to be handsome nor legendary. It needed to work. Always. Anywhere. And for longer. While Japan saw its planes and pilots disappear, the United States delivered more aircraft, more fuel, more ammunition, and more men. A supply line fed by railroads, ships, and factories that never slept. And this machine was about to show its full power, because the Hellcat hadn't been built just to survive. It had been built to exterminate, and his next testing ground would be the thin air of the Marianas, where war would become massacre. At the beginning of the war, a Japanese naval pilot was the pinnacle of the martial art applied to the sky. 3 years of training, more than 700 hours of flight, immersion in aerobatics, live shooting, and combat spiritual doctrine. They didn't just pilot, they embodied the spirit of Bushido. Each zero was an extension of the body, each combat a chance to die with honor. But the Japan of 1941 was not the same as it was in 1944. With the accumulated losses and the growing pressure in the Pacific, reality imposed itself. Time has disappeared, and with it, quality. At the height of the collapse, Japanese pilots were going into combat with 40 to 60 hours of flight time. Some had not even fired their weapons in real flight. Many had never flown at night. Fuel was so scarce that training was done on gliders. Ammunition was rationed. Radios were removed to lighten weight. Meanwhile, the United States followed a different logic. Each American naval pilot was trained with a minimum of 300 hours, 50 of them in planes of the same model that he would fly in combat. They trained on wide fields in Texas, in landing simulators, on replicas of aircraft carrier decks mounted on land. Each maneuver was repeated until it became a muscle reflex. And if they made a mistake, they started again. No one was sent to the Pacific without being ready. The American team did not mold heroes, Moldovan operators. The pilot was part of a system. It flew in pairs, followed radio instructions, accepted radar vectoring, and carried out missions with mathematical precision. He was protected by the armored fuselage, by group strategy, and above all, by a philosophy that valued his life as part of the national investment. An American pilot would shoot down an enemy, refuel, and return to the mission. A Japanese pilot, when he returned alive, came back more exhausted, more disillusioned, and more alone. Samurai doctrine did not allow for retreat. He did not admit coordination by radio. He did not value the collective. The tactic was to turn, chase, win with courage and instinct. Against zeros, that was enough. Against radar-guided Hellcats, protected by steel plates, armed with 650 machine guns and flying in tactical squadrons, it was suicide. By 1944, while the Americans were receiving 100-200 new pilots a month, Japan no longer even had fuel to train its own. And those who arrived on the front line encountered an unforgiving scenario. One of them was Ensign Yamamoto, named in the report of Commander Hashimoto, who was responsible for naval training at Kasumigara. Yamamoto had never fired in flight. I had never trained night flying. It lasted 7 minutes in his first match against Hellcats, and he did not return. Japan had faith. The United States sent engineers with wings. The contrast was absolute. One was idealistic, the other was pragmatic. One formed Knights of the Air, the other mission specialists. And this difference began to impact the numbers. The Hellcat's kill rate has already gone from 10 to 1, and it would rise even higher, because the skies of the Pacific were about to turn into the largest aerial massacre in modern history. And at the center of this massacre was the most brutal revelation of the entire campaign. Japan no longer had pilots. It had volunteers with 40 hours of flight time. There was fuel counted. It had light aluminum fighters trying to survive against planes that withstood crossfire. And the next clash would not be combat. It would be annihilation. In November 1944, the skies over Leyte Gulf were dark. Literally. Thick clouds hid the moon, and the Japanese pilots, in their Zeros, flew with the only tool they had left: intuition. With no radar, no ground support, no communication between aircraft, they groped the air like blind men in a windowless room. What they didn't know is that they were being watched, not by eyes but by machines. On aircraft carriers such as the USS Lexington and USS Enterprise, radar operators detected the slightest echoes in the darkness. They knew where the Zeros were, they knew their altitude, they knew their speed, and above all, they knew where the Hellcats should be to intercept them. That was the invisible turn of the air war. The Hellcats no longer fought with power and armor alone. They fought with electronic intelligence. A new group of pilots, the Night Fighters, were trained to operate F6F fighters, versions of the Hellcat equipped with wing-mounted AN/APS-6 radars. These systems, compact by the standards of the time, made it possible to identify enemy aircraft more than 8 kilometers away, even without visual contact. In night operations, the advantage was absolute. While Zero was virtually useless outside of daylight, the Hellcats became ruthless hunters of darkness. Lieutenant Commander Bruce Van Voorhis, one of the first to operate night missions with radar, described the experience as shooting a man who is still opening his eyes. The Japanese had no idea where the attack was coming from. The Hellcats appeared out of nowhere, fired at unlikely angles, and disappeared before any response. It was a one-sided war. In one of these missions conducted over the Philippine Sea, 5 Hellcats shot down 7 Zeros in 19 minutes without sustaining any damage. The radar data allowed for precise intercepts, controlled from ships more than 150 kilometers away. The American chain of command had expanded into the sky, and Japan didn't even know it. Imperial pilots also trained in visual reading, sound perception, silhouette recognition. Meanwhile, the Americans flew with vectorized information, guided by operators who mapped the battlefield in real time. With each combat, the disparity grew. Radar has become the brains behind brute force. It was the invisible link between the factory, the deck, and the pilot. And it was not limited to night missions. During the day, onboard radars detected enemy formations before human eyes could identify them. It was common for the Hellcats to be in the air even before the Zeros were spotted. Japan was locked into a 1939 war. The United States, operating in 1945. And this difference materialized in brutal statistics. The Japanese Naval Air Force lost more than 14,000 aircraft in the Pacific, almost half of them without even killing a single enemy. The Hellcats' kill rate already exceeded 19-1, a data-driven, production-driven, logic-controlled machine. Germany watched from a distance. Their focus was still on technical supremacy, on legendary aces, on exceptional machines such as the Bf-109 and Fw-190. But what they didn't understand was that the real power wasn't in the fastest aircraft. It was in the one that flew the fastest, the most accurately, and the most supportively. By 1944, the Americans had produced more than 96,000 aircraft. Germany, less than 40,000. The difference was almost 3-1. If this statistic impresses you, comment now. Logistics wins. Because in the end, that was what decided. Not the design, but the scale. Japan had already lost the sky. Germany still believed that it could beat him with ingenuity. But what they would soon see, over the English Channel in Berlin and in the skies over Dresden, would be a repeat of a pattern, an invisible, impersonal, merciless pattern. And that started here, with the Hellcat flying in the dark. In the next part, we'll look at how this same pattern made its way to dry land. Because when radars started guiding bombers, the destruction stopped being tactical. It became systematic. Lieutenant Eugene A. Valencia, Jr. did not fly for glory. He flew by method. Between 1944 and 1945, he would become the third greatest ace in American naval aviation, with 23 confirmed victories, but none of them the result of momentum or improvisation. His squad operated like a machine. 4 Hellcats in formation, 2 in front, 2 in the rear, each with defined sweep sectors, coordinated altitudes, pre-established angles of attack. The mission was simple: identify, fix, attack, and reposition. No duels, no spins, no gratuitous bravery. Each combat followed a systematized doctrine of engagement. When they spotted an enemy formation, the Hellcats did not dive in a dispersed manner. They divided the target into quadrants. The first pair made the frontal attack, shooting and opening space. The second dived soon after, hitting the scattered targets. The radio kept everyone connected. The average contact time was less than 2 minutes. The slaughter rate is close to 100%. The tactic earned a cruel nickname among pilots: lawnmower, because that's how they operated, sweeping the sky in parallel lines, eliminating each resistance with relentless precision. There was no room for lone heroes. There was coordination. Human gears embedded in an industrial logic. Each pilot knew what to do, where to look, when to fire, and if one fell, another took his place in the formation. There were no gaps. Japan, still stuck to the idea that the pilot was an individual warrior, saw his aces being torn apart by coordinated pairs that never separated. Aerial romanticism, of the noble duel, of the night of the clouds, died there, in the Pacific, and he died in a cruel way. Moral superiority had been replaced by organizational superiority. In an operation over Okinawa, Valencia and his squadron engaged 30 Zeros. They overturned 16. No Hellcat was lost. Most remarkably, at the end of the fighting, all the American fighters were still in formation. There was no confusion, no individual persecutions, just cool and effective execution. This is what the Japanese did not understand. For them, war was sacrifice, instinct, bravery. For Americans, it was a project, a given, a control. The lawnmower tactic was the pinnacle of this transformation, a replicable model, taught in manuals, trained in simulators, applied as science. Valencia was not a genius. It was a product, a driver perfectly shaped by a system that delivered results, and this system continued to grow. For every Zero killed, another was not replaced. For every Hellcat lost, 3 new ones arrived on deck. Japan was bleeding. And now not even the heavens offered shelter. Germany was watching everything. Their own aces like Erich Hartmann and Adolf Galland still operated within the old code of aerial honor, duels, maneuvers, individual glory, but it was already possible to feel the change. The Luftwaffe, too, was beginning to face an air force that did not fly for courage. It flew by procedure. And in the halls of Berlin, an intelligence report pointed to something frightening. The United States was training more pilots per month than Germany had graduated in 2 years. The statistic was not just a number, it was a sentence, because the logic that had swept the Zeros out of the Pacific sky was now pointing to the heart of Europe, and there was nothing they could do to stop her. October 1944. The Japanese High Command in Tokyo celebrates. The newspapers report a crushing victory over the Americans in the skies over Formosa. The radio broadcasts lists of alleged sunken ships, including 3 aircraft carriers, and hundreds of downed aircraft. The streets are filled with inflammatory speeches. The Empire had resisted, but across the sea on steel decks and radar cockpits, the truth came out in rolls of film and combat reports. Task Force 38, made up of dozens of U.S. Navy ships, had faced the largest Japanese air attack since Pearl Harbor. More than 700 Imperial aircraft were launched in successive waves against the American fleet stationed off Formosa. The Japanese expectation was to inflict catastrophic losses, but what followed was something else. A machine. Calculated. Cold. Deadly. The Hellcats took off in a timed sequence. They received vectors via long-range radar. Divided into squadrons and subgroups, they flew to their designated points without detours. The sky was divided into quadrants. The Japanese attacks, carried out by poorly trained, uncoordinated, and mutually uncovered formations, were met by American fighters operating as interlinked systems. The result was unilateral destruction. Cameras installed on the wings of the Hellcats recorded each engagement, and they showed what the Japanese High Command refused to admit. What happened over Formosa was not a battle. It was an execution. In 72 hours, the Americans lost 89 aircraft, most shot down by anti-aircraft fire during dives into ground positions. The Japanese, in contrast, lost 329 planes in the air alone. More than 150 veteran pilots died, and almost all the frontline squadrons of the Imperial Navy were destroyed. More alarming than the material loss was the human loss. Japan no longer had replacements. Each crashed rider was the end of a cycle. Each plane destroyed was an irrecoverable void. Task Force 38 didn't just survive. He continued his offensive without retreating. It bombed targets in Okinawa, northern Luzon, and even Taiwan. No American aircraft carriers were sunk. No destroyers lost. No contained progress. The gap between propaganda and facts was so wide that it generated unrest among mid-ranking Japanese officials. Internal reports warned that win estimates were being manipulated, but these alerts were no more than the first tables. The system had closed in on itself. The truth had become an enemy. Formosa was the silent turn. The moment when Japan, even with weapons, aircraft, and the will to fight, lost its ability to understand war itself. They continued to launch missions based on fanciful assumptions, betting everything on uncoordinated squads, led by doctrinaire ghosts. The Japanese Strategic Command no longer knew what was happening at the front. It relied on distorted reports, based on visual observations of fleeing pilots or unrealistic estimates of damage. The result was a cycle of decisions made based on fiction, which cost real lives. The United States, on the other hand, operated with metrics. Each mission was recorded, reviewed, timed. Each pilot filled out standardized reports. Each shot was calculated in ammunition consumption per target shot down. War, for them, was a data system, and the most brutal data emerged in the post-battle reports. The Hellcat's kill rate over Formosa had exceeded 15-1, a record until then. Admiral Mark Mitcher himself, commander of the embarked Air Force, classified the performance as mathematically unbelievable but mechanically inevitable. This was what Japan no longer understood. The enemy they faced was not just technological or industrial, it was conceptual. While they continued to train pilots to fly with faith, the Americans trained operators to follow wartime algorithms, and Formosa was the point of no return. From then on, each new combat would be a repetition of a tragic pattern. Suicide missions against an enemy who already knew where, when, and how you would arrive. General Ushijima, upon receiving the true data months later, would have a silent reaction. He just said, "We're sending kids to die against a gear," and this gear, already fully operational, was still just warming up. Because what would come next would be more than tactics. It would be doctrine applied to the full scale. And the first sample of that would explode over the Philippine Sea. June 19, 1944. The sky over the Philippine Sea was clear, cut only by the distant noise of approaching engines. For the Japanese High Command, that was the decisive day. After months of losses, humiliations, and setbacks, Operation AGO would bring the Empire's embarked Air Force face to face with the U.S. Navy in its attempt to defend the Mariana Islands. More than 400 Japanese aircraft were launched in successive waves, in attacks planned to saturate the American defenses. What followed, however, was not a battle. It was a collapse. Task Force 58's carrier radars identified the first strike groups, still more than 240 kilometers away. Vector operators guided the Hellcats with surgical advance, positioning combat air patrols at the exact interception points. Each U.S. squadron operated as an autonomous cell, with pre-assigned tasks: interdiction, cover, rearguard. By the time the first Japanese group came into visual range, the Hellcats were already waiting. The Imperial formations, composed mostly of pilots with less than 100 hours of flight time, faced American veterans flying armored, fast, and absurdly well-armed machines. The Japanese fighters were trying to maneuver, but their once deadly spins now only exposed them to bursts of 650 machine guns per side. Diving, a once effective tactic, was useless against radar and integrated communications. The Hellcat's radio reported the altitude, direction, and distance of enemies in real time. In 1 hour of combat, 42 Japanese aircraft were destroyed. By the end of the day, the number had risen to 346. The term that spread among American pilots was cruel but accurate: turkey shoot, a metaphor that indicated the absence of risk, the total imbalance between hunter and hunted. It was the final realization that the Japanese Naval Air Force had ceased to be a threat, and it was more than technical. It was structure. Japan no longer had adapted doctrine, nor a functional chain of command. Its pilots were launched on suicide attacks with no support, no radar, no cover. Japan was still fighting as it had in 1941, but the world had changed. The United States at that point was not just winning, they were redefining the concept of air warfare. The operation in the Marianas was coordinated from a floating naval command center, connected by radio to all ships and aircraft. Each carrier operated in synchronization. Each pilot knew exactly where each enemy was. It was war transformed into a network. Germany watched, and he didn't understand. Air Marshal Hermann Goering, upon being informed of Japan's loss of more than 300 aircraft in a single day, reportedly said, "They lost an air force in 12 hours. This is not defeat, it's dissolution." And in fact it was. By the end of the Battle of the Philippine Sea, the Imperial Navy had lost what was left of its embarked offensive aviation. Of the 430 planes launched, fewer than 100 returned. The Japanese carriers were not sunk that day, but they were emptied on purpose. They became floating hulls with no strategic function. Without wings, there was no strength. Without pilots, there was no war. Japan didn't just lose a fight. He missed his last chance to influence the course of the war in the Pacific, and the world watched, astonished. The brutal effectiveness of a gear in motion. But the most impressive thing would come from the after-action numbers. The United States lost only 29 fighter planes that day. and in 48 hours they had already replaced all of them, because the machine that had beaten the Zeros was still producing, and the next piece of that system would show that hell could be mass manufactured. On June 19, 1944, the skies of the Philippine Sea were the scene of one of the most extraordinary performances in the history of military aviation. At the center of the formation, taking off from the deck of the USS Essex, was Commander David McCampbell, a calm, methodical man who did not raise his voice or dramatize the mission. It flew as it breathed, with precision. Aboard his F6F Hellcat, he was leading an interception squadron when he spotted a Japanese formation of bombers and fighters approaching. They were much more numerous, but McCampbell didn't hesitate. He started the climb, positioned himself with an altitude advantage, and started to execute, one by one. In less than 90 minutes, he shot down 7 enemy aircraft, without suffering a single impact, no breakdown, no hesitation. And 3 months later, it would repeat the feat on an even larger scale. 9 aircraft shot down in a single mission, the highest number recorded by an American naval pilot in a single flight. But what makes McCampbell unique is not just his marksmanship or his coolness. It's the system around you. His Hellcat operated on very high-octane fuel, distributed by mobile tankers in the middle of the ocean. His fighter had been prepared by a maintenance team working in 3 shifts, with interchangeable parts that could be replaced in less than 20 minutes. Its communication was constant with the ship's vectoring center, guiding each maneuver with updated data via radar. And its armament, 650 machine guns, was calibrated to the millimeter to converge at 300 yards, turning each volley into a deadly cone. McCampbell was not a samurai. He was an engineer with wings, a lethal machine operator, trained with more than 2,000 hours of flight time, in-depth technical knowledge of the enemy, and absolute control of the situation. Its effectiveness was less about bravery and more about gear, a link within a system that worked, and that expanded individual potential to superhuman heights. For each mission, there was a plan. For each plan, there was a protocol. And for each protocol, a logistical support chain that would ensure that nothing fails. Meanwhile, Japanese pilots were already flying low-octane fuel, in poorly maintained fighters and almost non-existent communication. Many left the ground without even knowing who the leader of the formation was. They just knew where to go, and that they shouldn't go back. The statistics were brutal. McCampbell flew 89 combat missions. He returned from all of them. It shot down 34 enemy aircraft, and he lost. 0 companions in your unit during your direct leadership missions. And here's the moment when the data speaks loudest. While McCampbell shot down 9 fighters in a single mission, Germany, in 1944, began rationing fuel for even its most experienced aces. American production of jet fuel was 10 times higher than Germany's that year. 10 times. If this difference surprises you, write in the comments. Logistics wins, because without fuel, there is no takeoff, and without a system, there is no hero. The McCampbell case was not an anomaly. It was the pinnacle of a model. The United States had achieved something that no other nation in the war had achieved, turning an ace into a factory product, trainable, replicable, replaceable, and that was the scariest thing for the enemies. It was not enough to take down a good pilot. There would be another one like it tomorrow, and then another, and another. Germany began to feel the same weight in the skies of Europe. Their aces no longer faced inexperienced pilots. They faced mission-trained operators, supplied by a country that could afford to miss, refuel, and try again. But Japan could not. Each plane lost was a hole. Each crashed driver, a definitive absence. The scales didn't just tilt, it plummeted. And the next step of this gear would be even more ruthless, because the Hellcats had already ruled the skies. But now, something even bigger would come from the aircraft carriers. Something that not only controlled the air, but erased entire cities with geometric precision. After the massacre in the Philippine Sea, something deeper than the loss of aircraft began to manifest itself among the survivors of Japanese naval aviation. It wasn't just the fear of combat. It was the fear of taking off. Among the few returning pilots, the reports began to take on a somber tone. Some spoke of fighters that came out of nowhere, others in black wings that swept the sky without being seen. The name Hellcat began to be whispered in the hangars, not as a technical designation, but as an entity. Many claimed not to have even seen the enemy before they were hit. American air divisions, guided by radar, flying in formation and with total mastery of space, had become invisible. and therefore omnipresent. War is no longer a duel. It became a condemnation. For the young Japanese joining the squadrons, the mission was no longer victory or glorious sacrifice. It was annihilation. On land, doctors began to observe alarming symptoms. An increasing number of pilots experienced bouts of anxiety, memory lapses, tremors before missions. The term blue hell was recorded in more than one personal diary, describing not combat, but the simple act of ascending to heaven. A generation of men trained to die with honor was now beginning to crumble before they had even encountered the enemy. And the most devastating thing is that the enemy seemed to feel nothing. The Americans flew consecutive missions. They exchanged pilots, planes, formations. If they lost one squad, another was already in the air. The Japanese pilot was fighting a shadow, and this shadow had fuel, radar, heavy weaponry, structure. A lieutenant at the Tinian base recorded in his diary, "We left with 12, we went back 2, and we can't even shoot." Others describe situations where they tried evasive maneuvers, only to find that the Hellcats were above, to the side, and behind, as if they had multiple eyes. Omnipresence was technical, but the impact was spiritual. The industrialization of war had reached the field of the mind. The plane was no longer an extension of the warrior. It was part of a machine, and the warrior, replaceable part only. In less than 6 months after the Marianas, Japan lost psychological control of its own skies. Missions began to be canceled due to the emotional breakdown of pilots. Night flights have been reduced dramatically. Fear had infiltrated the gears of doctrine. Veteran pilots refused to lead formations. Entire squads were being made up of adolescent recruits, apathetic, without conviction. The Hellcats, on the contrary, kept emerging. In every mission, in every theater, the ability of the United States to maintain full squadrons operating on multiple fronts simultaneously added to the impression that they were infinite. And in a way, they were. By 1944, the United States was producing 2,500 Hellcats per month. Japan, in the same period, was able to deliver only 300 fighters of all types. Each month, the Americans put 8 times as much air power in the air. And for each plane, there was a trained pilot, refined fuel, spare parts, ammunition, and integrated command. The war had ceased to be a dispute. It was now an algorithmic progression. Germany, upon receiving reports from the Imperial Japanese Navy, belatedly realized the scope of the problem. The same symptoms were beginning to emerge among his own pilots, especially after the Allied landings in Normandy. A Luftwaffe document drawn up in November 1944 warned, "Our men are beginning not to believe in the possibility of victory. This is more dangerous than any bomb." The samurai doctrine had been exhausted. Faith, exhausted. Only the sound of the engines remained, and the certainty that somewhere in the sky, a Hellcat awaited. But what would come next would make it clear that air dominance was just the beginning, because, from the same deck where the Hellcats took off, now weapons were being launched that erased cities in minutes. In October 1944, in the makeshift hangars of Mabalacat Air Base in the Philippines, a group of young people in silence listened to the last words of an instructor. It was not a lesson in tactics, nor a combat simulation session. It was a formal farewell. These young men, many with faces that had not yet felt the razor of their beards, would be the first to embark on what the Imperial Navy was beginning to call special attacks. The technical name was accurate. The doctrine was no longer to intercept, fight, or win. It was to achieve and die. In the absence of veterans, fuel, ammunition, and time, Japan abandoned the concept of air warfare as a confrontation between forces. He began to see his planes as human projectiles. It was not an ideological choice. It was a logistical breakdown. With the accumulated losses in the Marianas, Formosa, and the Philippines, Japan had lost more than 80% of its experienced pilots. Training programs, which previously took 3 years and required hundreds of flight hours, have been reduced to weeks. The cadets flew less than 50 hours before they were considered ready. Many had not even fired a machine gun in real flight. Others did not know how to land in adverse weather conditions. The absence of fuel made any simulation too expensive, and the use of ammunition to train was seen as a strategic waste. There was only one way left: to use these young people not as pilots, but as warheads. The birth of the kamikazes was not an act of exaltation. It was a brutal admission of powerlessness. The idea, approved by Vice Admiral Takejiro Onishi, was simple. Replace American technological precision with psychological impact. If the Americans had radars, logistics, and mass production, Japan would respond with faith, sacrifice, and moral shock. But even in this, the numbers spoke louder. In the first kamikaze attacks carried out during the Battle of Leyte Gulf in October 1944, about 40 planes were launched against the American fleet. The success rate was only 14%. Most were shot down before reaching the target, and those who succeeded caused temporary damage. No major ships were sunk. On the other hand, the Americans shot down more than 30 planes and killed dozens of young people who, months earlier, were on school benches. The industrialization of warfare had reached a point where even human sacrifice could no longer make a strategic impact. It was the end of the age of the warrior. The kamikaze doctrine carried within it the ultimate image of an empire with no options. There was no longer faith in the system itself. There was no longer any way to catch air. Only the body remained as a weapon, and yet, it was insufficient. The Hellcats, with frontal armor, reinforced structure and constant air cover, proceeded to shoot down the kamikazes before impact, and if any plane escaped, the American ships were already adapted. New defense formations, more sensitive radars, automatic anti-aircraft guns. The war of the heavens had been won. Japan was now trying to drill steel with meat. A U.S. Navy document, drafted in December 1944, described the kamikaze attacks as desperate actions by an adversary who has lost control of time and technology. The coldness of the report contrasted with the drama on Japanese soil. Families delivered their children in silent ceremonies without applause. Fear had supplanted patriotic fervor. The empire, once built on the glory of the aerial victory at Pearl Harbor, now buried teenagers in graves without combat. The contrast was stark. While the United States produced 7,000 pilots a month, Japan trained with difficulty 300, and even these 300, for the most part, did not know how to face an invisible enemy. Because modern warfare, guided by radar, fought in formation and sustained by numbers, could no longer be won with courage. On Okinawa, on Iwo Jima, the kamikazes would continue flying, but they no longer caused panic. They had become part of the contingency plan, registered, laid down, slaughtered. Germany, as it observed this transition, understood the magnitude of what was to come. At a secret meeting in Berlin in January 1945, a Luftwaffe colonel said, "If our Eastern allies are using young people as bombs, it is because they no longer believe in the aircraft." It was true. Japan no longer believed in itself, and the United States. They were just beginning to use up everything they had prepared, because in addition to the Hellcats, the radars and the logistics, something bigger, quieter, and more definitive, it was already being loaded. And when it fell, it wouldn't be on a ship. It would be about an entire city. April 1945. The island of Okinawa, the last bastion before the main Japanese archipelago, becomes the scene of a battle that redefines the concept of total war. The Japanese Empire, suffocated by defeats, surrounded by the sea and with no room for strategy, plays its last card: launch the biggest kamikaze attack in history. Nearly 2,000 sorties are directed against the American fleet anchored around the island. The mission is simple: sink ships with your own body. But what Japanese pilots find isn't an unsuspecting fleet. It's an aerial wall of steel, radar, and coordination. The F6F Hellcats, now operating with improved systems, onboard radars, and refined tactical formations, are not just fighters. They are a floating line of defense. Squadrons fly on synchronized blocks, covering approach vectors with overlapping fire and early interception vectorization. The result is overwhelming. Up to 80% of kamikazes are shot down before they even see their targets. The battle is no longer between planes. It is between despair and system, and the system wins. An American pilot on the USS Bunker Hill describes the pattern of combat as a cutting field, where things would come straight and fall before they knew they were being seen. Onboard radars pick up signals tens of miles away, allowing the Hellcats to take off before the kamikazes even cross the horizon. Unlike the classic image of the heroic pilot dueling in the sky, now the strength lies in anticipation. Each squadron is directed by radio commandos operating in perfect sync with ships, interceptors, and anti-aircraft artillery. The American war machine doesn't just attack, it predicts. Each kamikaze shot down is one less crater on the deck, One less body sunk in the hull, one less funeral in the Pacific. The irony of this story is that the solution was in front of them. While Japan turned pilots into bombs, the United States turned technology into shields. If you're enjoying unraveling these facts, show your support. Like and subscribe so we can bring you more in-depth content. Because what unfolds in Okinawa is more than a battle. It is proof that modern war is no longer won with isolated bravery, but with doctrine, intelligence, and replacement power. The Hellcats land, refuel, exchange ammunition, and take off again, all in less than 12 minutes. In less than an hour, the same plane can make 2-3 sorties with 3 different pilots operating within a schedule that resembles an assembly line more than a combat front. Japan, on the other hand, is witnessing the absolute exhaustion of its offensive capacity. For each kamikaze thrown, a combat cell is lost. There is no substitution. There is no second chance. And as the Hellcats dominate the sky, they also protect the aircraft carriers, the battleships, the transports. It is the first time that combat aviation has become a tool for systematic defense against suicide attacks, and it fulfills this function with mathematical effectiveness. Of the nearly 2,000 kamikazes released, less than 15% manage to achieve anything. Most are shot down by interceptors, others by automated artillery. Damage is recorded, but they do not alter the course of the war. The aerial wall had firmed up. One fact crystallizes the difference. While the United States produced 92,000 fighter planes in 1945, Japan can barely keep its factories running, bombed, isolated, without raw materials. Japanese production of fighter jets that same year did not reach 10% of what had been projected. The war had crossed the moral frontier, and American technology, instead of simply destroying, began to protect. The deck armor, the flame arrest systems, the onboard hospitals, the fighters patrolling the sky and sea. It was all part of a gear geared toward a new priority, keeping the people alive. And in the center of this gear, up in the sky of Okinawa, the Hellcats continued to cut through the silence with 50 bursts. But what would come next would not require more bursts. It would require silence. Because the empire that now clung to the faith, he would be confronted with something that no faith could stop. By mid-1945, the skies over the Pacific were no longer owned by any pilot. They belonged to the system. And at the heart of this system, the F6F Hellcat reached its most lethal version, not by dramatic changes in appearance, but by hidden, precise, mathematical innovations. Now equipped with the K-14 gyro viewfinder, the American fighter no longer relied on intuition to shoot. All it took was to align the target, and the system itself calculated the deflection, the future point, the invisible curve between present and impact. In an aerial combat, this was not an advantage. It was a sentence. Japanese pilots, trained in manual aiming, had to estimate speed, angle, and trajectory with their eyes. The Hellcat did it in seconds, and when it fired, hit. But that was only a fragment of the equation. The R-2800 engine, already legendary, now received water methanol injection, temporarily increasing power to 2,200 horsepower. This gave the Hellcat an extra advantage in short takeoffs, fast climbs, and vertical combat. In tests, this thrust allowed the plane to reach 3,800 feet per minute, a number unattainable by any Japanese aircraft in operation. And then there were the underwing rockets, standardized from 1945 onwards. There were 8 5-inch tubes that turned each Hellcat into a fighter bomber. Against troop concentrations, makeshift airstrips, and convoys, the rockets offered range and destructive power without sacrificing speed. The multiplicity of functions was intentional. The same plane that escorted bombers could destroy targets on the ground and still protect the fleet, without changing platforms, without changing pilots. And then, there was the factory. Not the factory as a building, but as a concept. The F6F was the first American fighter to reach the production pace of 1 unit every 60 minutes. From the Grumman assembly line, 1 fully functional plane came out per hour, riveted, tested, equipped, and combat ready. In a single month, more than 600 Hellcats crossed the skies of the Pacific. It was not a miracle. It was logistics. Every part of the plane, from the propeller to the landing gear, from the tanks to the armament mounts, was standardized and interchangeable. This meant that a Hellcat damaged in combat could be repaired on any aircraft carrier, with parts from any factory, by any trained mechanic. The average time for return to service? less than 24 hours. Japan, on the other hand, faced shortages of aluminum, synthetic rubber, hardened steel, and even screws. Nakajima engines needed manual machining. The airframe still relied on plywood. And the worst, each fighter model required unique parts, specific tools, custom adjustments. What for the Americans was a process, for the Japanese was still an art. And art is not reproduced en masse. The collapse was technical but also philosophical. The empire had relied on the skill of its men. The United States relied on the replicability of its systems. The difference was not only in the sky, it was on ships, in workshops, in warehouses, in manuals. An American pilot could change planes in the middle of the campaign and find everything in the same place. Levers, panels, controls, fuel reading. A Japanese pilot needed to relearn each model. And even when the best fighter available flew, it flew without knowing if there would be parts tomorrow. And so, quietly, Japan realized that it had not been defeated by a specific weapon. No bullet, no missile, no bombing had ended their air supremacy. What destroyed it was continuity, a production line that never stopped, a logic of war that did not depend on luck, genius, bravery, a war that depended on numbers, and the numbers, they were all on the other side. When the Germans received the intelligence reports on the American logistics chain in the Pacific, a Luftwaffe general reportedly said, "If they can produce the sky, what else can they make?" The answer would come shortly after, and it would have no wings, but it would fall out of thin air as if it had. When the Japanese hangars, already silent in the post-surrender, finally received the intact wreckage of a captured F6F Hellcat, it was not with contempt that the engineers approached. It was with reverence. There was no more laughter. There was no more irony. The war was over. And now, in front of that machine with wide wings and a rough appearance, there remained only the task of understanding and admitting. A technical group, consisting of former test pilots, Mitsubishi engineers, and veteran combat officers, met in Yokosuka to dissect the enemy they had never understood in life. When they opened the fuselage panels, they found the unexpected: modularity. Everything was accessible. The exhaust valves replaceable in minutes. The R-2800 engine hinged on components that could be swapped out without disassembling the assembly. The hydraulic lines marked by colors and instructions. The interior of the Hellcat was not pretty, but it was functional and designed for the battlefield. A Nakajima engineer, upon observing the arrangement of the machine guns, commented in a low voice, "They thought about maintenance first, only then in the pilot." But it didn't stop there. The cockpit compartment contained electrical redundancies. One circuit failed, another took over. The radio had a backup system. There was even a small key that allowed the pilot to change the communication channel if the primary was intercepted. None of this existed in the Zeros. None of this was considered necessary. Japan had bet on lightness, art, individual ability. The Americans had bet on the mistake, more precisely in the inevitable error, and that's why they built planes that kept flying even when everything went wrong. Saburo Sakai, one of the last living aces of Imperial Japan, touched the fuselage of the Hellcat and remained silent. Later, years later, he would write in his memoirs, "Zero made us believe that we were samurai. The Hellcat showed us that we were just men with swords facing an autocannon." The phrase was not only poetic, it was a diagnosis. The Japanese doctrine did not fail through cowardice. He failed by blind faith. He believed that bravery, dexterity, and spirit would be enough against metal, mathematics, and production. What no one understood, until it was too late, was that the Americans had not created an aircraft. They had created a system. A Hellcat did not fight alone. It was part of a mesh. Communications, radar, logistics, flight doctrine, standardized training, onboard support. While a Japanese pilot slept in a shed and improvised fuel, an American pilot woke up on a ship with hot coffee, a signed maintenance check, and a map vectored by the intelligence service. The Japanese flew for honor. The Americans flew on 100-octane fuel refined on a continental scale. And in the end, that was the difference. The Hellcat didn't beat Zero in the air. He won on the ground. At the factory, in port, on deck, on the radio. Every part of the machine reflected this. The brakes themselves had a simplified cooling system for short landings. The braking cables were designed to absorb impact without twisting the landing gear. The wings could be folded in seconds, allowing more fighters to take up less space. War had become engineering. Zero, when it emerged, was art. But art doesn't scale. Art does not repeat itself. Art does not survive when the enemy releases 1,000 copies of the same idea. A Japanese naval officer, during interrogation after the surrender, summed up the high command's thinking. We were not prepared to fight a concept. The Hellcat wasn't just an airplane. It was the materialization of a logic. And perhaps after all, this was the greatest lesson, that in the industrial age, courage still matters, but it needs to be accompanied by calculation. Because on the other side of the world, while Japan was training swordsmen from the air, America was building an assembly line, and when it started working, no one stopped it. But there was one piece of data that had not yet been released to the Japanese public, a figure that explained the inevitability of the end, a number that did not involve projectiles, engines, or fuel. It involved time. And time, as it would be discovered in the final part of this story, was the only weapon that the Americans also knew how to manufacture. The F6F Hellcat was not just a fighter aircraft. It was the visible manifestation of an invisible transformation, the moment when war ceased to be a battlefield and became a production line, where victories no longer depended only on the skill of one man, but on the synchrony of thousands. As it flew over the Pacific, the Hellcat carried more than machine guns and fuel. It carried systems. He carried doctrine. It carried the response time of an onboard radar, the logistics of an aircraft carrier that operated like a floating city, the efficiency of a training that converted civilians into war operators with statistical accuracy. Each mission involved dozens of variables that, in Japan, were still seen as contingencies. In the United States, they were part of the plan. When a squadron of Hellcats took off, it did so with the certainty that there would be fuel along the route, that the radio would be clean, that the ground or onboard radar would vector it to the target, that friendly artillery would know who was coming, that there would be parts in case it needed to land damaged, that there would be another trained pilot if it did not return. Nothing was improvised. Everything was coordinated. Japanese logic, still based on the idea of the virtuous warrior, succumbed to a model that eliminated luck. The American pilot didn't have to be brilliant. He just had to follow the manual. And that's exactly what made the system unbeatable. The Hellcat was a product, but also a process. Every flight instruction, every turn of attack, every engine setting had been tested, measured, replicated. The result of this was the statistic that shocked the Axis strategists themselves. For every Hellcat lost, about 19 enemy planes were shot down. This rate was not the result of luck. It was a direct consequence of integration. Japan had been defeated not in heaven, but in the idea of heaven that it held. War was no longer a collection of combats. It was a network, and the Hellcat, with its wide wings and armored cockpit, was just the visible tip of that network. Most of them were out of sight. Radar operators, maintenance engineers, weapons technicians, logistics strategists, deck commanders, meteorologists, flight instructors. A Japanese pilot had to improvise with instinct. An American pilot flew with dozens of invisible professionals sustaining his mission, and perhaps that is why the doctrine has collapsed. Because what Japan considered courage, the United States began to consider a risk variable. The American system was designed to work even without heroes, and when a hero emerged, like McCampbell, he was not only celebrated for his bravery, but for his ability to operate in harmony with everything around him. The era of romantic aces was coming to an end. In its place, the modern warfare operator was born, a man trained to be part of the machine, a man whose function was not to shine, but to fulfill. The Hellcat wasn't the prettiest, but it was the most functional, and that in the new doctrine was everything. The skies of the Pacific have ceased to be improvised territory and have become an extension of American industry. Refueling was systematic, the orders vectorized, the patrols choreographed like factory shifts. Each plane that took off was part of a cycle, and the cycle never stopped. While the Japanese were still trying to reformulate their doctrine based on the codes of honor and sacrifice, the Americans were already creating mathematical models of air saturation, predictive statistics of pilot replacement, and radio engagement simulations. The war had crossed an invisible border, and many didn't even realize it. But when they realized, it was too late. In 1945, captured Japanese officers reported that the greatest fear in the higher commands was no longer the air attack itself, but the inability to respond with coordination. They saw the Hellcats swarm in, always in sync, always at the right time. The reaction when it existed was isolated, desperate, late. Japanese doctrine had become noise. The American one, an orchestra. The F6F Hellcat, therefore, should not be remembered only as the plane that shot down 5,223 enemies, but as the symbol of the birth of a new paradigm, one in which victory is not won by those who fly faster or shoot better, but by those who can turn war into a process, in system, in routine. The Hellcat flew with the gravity of a machine that knew its role, and his role was simple: to win, to replace himself, to multiply, like a gear, like an assembly line, like a doctrine that, when implemented with precision, transforms the chaos of war in statistics. And it is precisely one of these statistics that closes this part of the story. Between 1943 and 1945, the United States produced an F6F Hellcat every hour, 24 a day, 700 per month. Japan, by comparison, manufactured about 90 fighters a month, of varying models with unique parts and fragile logistics. If this difference surprised you, write in the comments. Logistics wins, because there was still an unanswered question. What happened to the few zeros that survived the end of the war, and why, even after everything, some of them still took off, knowing that they would not return? The last zero fell not with a bang, but with the silence of surrender. When the hangars were empty and the radios ceased, only the bitter realization remained. The F6F Hellcat did not defeat an air force. It dismantled a belief. Japan, which for years cultivated the idea of the pilot as a warrior, saw this myth dissolve under the weight of a gear that did not stop. The American industrial machine didn't just win in the sky. She rewrote the rules of heaven. Each battle narrated in this video confirmed the central thesis. The war of the future, and already then the war of the present, would not be decided by honor, but by integration. Not for the duel, but for the doctrine. Not by faith, but by the flow. The Hellcat is proof that armored tanks, interchangeable engines, and series-trained pilots can together break even the most solid tradition. The great lesson, universal and definitive, is clear. There is no tactic that can resist a supply chain that works. Bravery is noble, but the logistics are invincible. At the end of the war, a Japanese officer, examining the wreckage of an American fleet, muttered, "We have been defeated by men who could count." If you believe that history needs to be told with facts, sources, and respect for the complexity of events, please leave your like and sign up to support our mission of historical research and reconstruction. Comment which data shocked you the most in this video. Was it the 5,123 Hellcat victories, the production of 1 plane per hour, or the pilot who shot down 9 enemies alone? And activate the bell so you don't miss the next devastating fact that fell in the shadows of time. Because the story doesn't end here. The next account reveals how the silent engineering of a factory defeated the armored arrogance of the African desert. Don't go away yet. Listen to the next true story that will appear on the screen. Always remember, logistics determines strategy. Watch the next video here on the channel with another incredible story.